You take.
So let's sound like we know what we're doing.
You take a deep breath first.
Thank you. So let's go around the room and introduce them. There isn't anybody on Zoom, is there?
There are.
Yes, there are.
Half dozen. Yeah.
Hello. Let's go around and introduce ourselves. And when you say your name, say please, what is your experience with To Kill a Mockingbird? Okay, so Stu, do you want to start?
Yeah, Stu Fung. I read it twice. I don't remember how old I was the first time, if it was in school or not, but love the books. I ended up reading it twice.
Okay. And the movie, I was going to ask about the movie too.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody saw the movie. Vern?
Vic, yeah, like probably everybody else here, I read it in high school and then I got it to the library and read it again. So
Oh, you've read it recently.
yeah, just from the last couple of months. Just finished it last night or the night before.
Okay, Margaret.
Margaret Haddix, and I read it in high school, but it was not assigned. It's very odd. I never had to read. I was an English major in college and never had to read it. And I did not refresh my memory. Vern did, so it's a little fuzzy. But a couple of years ago, or whenever the To Set a Watchman came out, I was part of this effort that Barnes and Noble had decided they were going to have a rereading of the entire To Kill a Mockingbird. And so I had to sit in the cafe and out loud read a chapter of it, not the whole thing, but a chapter. And they said to me, if there are certain words you don't want to say out loud, you do not have to say them.
Oh.
And I was like, you don't want to be.
Yeah, the person who said that word, right? Good morning. I'm asking everyone to introduce themselves and to say what your connection was to Kill a Mockingbird, when you read it, or if you haven't read it, and so on. So I'll come back to you, Marianne. And
I'm Richard Burney, and I'm afraid that I must be of the age that this book wasn't assigned in high school, because the only thing, the movie had just come out. And so I did see that, but it's been long enough. Like I can't remember what happened yesterday.
okay, let's talk to the people. I see Bill. You want to start, Bill?
All right, I'm Bill Eider, and I read it in the fall of 1962, and that's the last time that I looked at it, and I've not seen the movie, so it's pretty hazy to me at this point.
And I can't read. Daniel? No.
Karen.
Karen. I can't hear you. You must be muted.
I'm Karen Gibson, and I have not read To Kill a Mockingbird. When it came out in 1960, that was my senior year of high school, and it was not required. And in college, it wasn't either. I had heard of it. I think I may have seen it on in the movies at one time. I'm not sure. I really have pretty much forgotten if I have had any occasion to read it.
After this, you'll want to. And I can't see. Joni?
I came in late. I'm sorry. What was the question?
Have you read To Kill a Mockingbird, seen the movie, and if so, when?
Okay. Yes, I saw the movie. I have read the book 3 times.
Oh.
I also read
Watchmen?
The Watchmen, the prequel, and actually led the discussion on that one for my book group. So
what am I doing here?
I have a history with Mockingbird. It's definitely one of my top 5 favorite books, and I've read a lot of books.
Okay, Kathy?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Coincidentally, I took it out again to read about 2 or 3 months ago. I don't even know how many times I've read this book, maybe half a dozen times. And it wasn't required reading. I think it was the summer bookmobile, and that's where I got the book. And then coincidentally, Turner Classic Movies had the movie on about 6 weeks ago. So Dwayne and I watched the movie again.
Well, good. How about you, Andy?
Andy Balser, and I have read it and seen the movie, but I can't even remember how long it's been.
Yeah.
It's been a long time.
Well, I'm going to count on those of you who have read this recently, because I have not. There are 2 good reasons for that. One good reason is that when Tom asked me to lead this discussion, because he's doing confirmation class today, I said yes. provided my brother-in-law hadn't died. We haven't gone to be with him, but that turned out to have happened, a couple weeks ago. So there was that. I promptly put the book on request at the library and I have not gotten it. But the other reason is I can't read it anyway. It's this. I have cataracts. So I made my way line by line through the leader guide and part of the first chapter. If you have a chance, I hope you'll read this by next time. Particularly those of you for whom this is fresh in your memory of the book, I think that you'll find it definitely a helpful thing to have read it. So I want to start with what they suggest I do for the first thing, which is to talk about where are my notes? Oh, here. I had notes in here. Okay, so this is Scout's story. And oh, we want to watch the DVD first. There's a DVD of the guy who wrote this. Okay, sorry. No worries. Andy's gonna have my back here because I'm feeling very disorganized today.
Ready?
Yep.
The mockingbird gets its name because it mimics what it hears in the world and then sings it back. The mockingbird song is familiar, and it's supposed to be. That's kind of the point. You've probably heard the mockingbird sing, and you probably even didn't know that you were hearing a mockingbird. In the New Orleans area, the mockingbird song is what you've just heard. It's that major fifth, that da-da, 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 da-da. And it's everywhere. In New Orleans, street bands organize themselves according to that tune. When the trumpet player plays da-da, 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 the other members of the band know to pick up their instruments and hit the streets. But we aren't quite sure whether the mockingbird is mimicking the trumpet player or whether the trumpet player is mimicking the mockingbird. This is a really great example of the church's relationship with culture. It's a bit of a dance. Sometimes there's tension. It's not the case that in the church we should divorce ourselves from culture, something that we keep outside of the walls of the church. It's rather impossible. Culture is simply what we make of the world. God offers the raw ingredients, and culture is what we cook up. Now, sometimes what happens in the church influences what happens outside of the church. For example, growing up in New Orleans, the public school cafeteria served only fish on Fridays during Lent because of the Catholic influence. But sometimes things that happen outside of the church influence what happens within the walls of the church, like celebrating Mother's Day or Veterans Day. Or maybe before high school graduation, you invite the youth to speak. It's not that we divorce ourselves between the church and culture. In many ways, they're one and the same. There's a great dance of what God is doing, both within the walls of the church and outside of the walls of the church. Culture is how we learn who we are and what our story is. Who we are and whose we are. We learn from our parents, we learn from the school, we learn from our neighborhoods of who we are, and then we mimic that back until we are able to recognize who we are, so that we might tell our own story. Killer Mockingbird is Scout's story. It's the story of how she discovers who she is, who her family is, who her town is, and how she recognizes the brokenness of her family. Now, it seems like it's full.
Virginia, someone has a TV on somewhere and it's interfering with.
Yeah, Andy just put a chat out asking people to mute their microphones, but if people don't know that they're on, yeah, it's hard.
Okay, let's try again.
and organized
Good.
in one piece. Everyone has their particular place, everyone has their particular role, but it's actually quite broken. Not everyone is seen as God's child, not everyone has the same rights, and even in the midst of it seeming together, it's actually quite broken. Scout's story is formed and framed through brokenness. Her story begins with her remembering Jim, her brother, Jim's broken arm. And then her story ends when we, as the audience, hear how Jim's arm was broken. Now, if Jim was our narrator, maybe the story might be different. But my suspicion is that brokenness will still be at its center. To Kill a Mockingbird is a story about brokenness as well as redemption, and that's the story of the church as well. Our story as Christians is shaped and formed by the brokenness of Jesus and the resurrection that came from that brokenness. Not long ago, I had a church member who met me before worship, and she was broken. We had a quick prayer before the service started, and she was down. She was defeated. But after worship, she came and met with me. And she said that when I was at the altar table breaking the bread is when she realized that our story is found in the midst of brokenness. In other words, she felt that she needed to be whole in order to go to church and worship with us. But it is actually in our brokenness and our willingness to share the ways in which we are broken that we are made whole. Being whole and having it all together is not a prerequisite for being a part of the body of Christ. It's a broken body. It's a broken body in which blood was outpoured for the forgiveness of our sins. But the good news is that the story didn't end there. The story ended with an empty tomb. It ended with resurrection. But just like Macomb looks like it's whole, even though it is broken, Scout helps us understand the ways in which they present their brokenness. So the question really is not whether we're broken or whether we're whole, but whether we're ready to share our brokenness, whether we're ready to enter into the brokenness of the bread, the brokenness of the body, so that we might be made whole. There's a tension sometimes between the trumpet player and the mockingbird, or the church and the world, so to speak. But it is in that place where a broken world meets a broken body that there's a new creation. Where the trumpet player and the mockingbird meet, a new song is offered. So the question is, are you willing to offer your brokenness? Are you willing to learn a new song so that you might know your story?
I wasn't wearing masks today, but since I'm a long ways from the call. Any comments about that, particularly those of you who have read the book recently? Did you pick up on brokenness when you read your book? Okay, well, that's it. So here's what I
I'd
would
say
like.
this is very timely considering where we are as a church right now.
Watch. Yes, for Peter and for you have just come in, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, Tracy, sorry. We have all introduced ourselves and said whether we had read the book, To Kill a Mockingbird, and seen the movie or both, and when. So everybody else has done that. Do you want to introduce yourselves and say that?
My name is Tracy Tate. I'm sorry, I'm tardy. I read the book, I think, in high school, so it's been a long time, and I've seen the movie, and my daughter and I are going to see the Aaron Sorkin adaptation in June.
Oh,
So she is reading it in her ELA, as a choice book in her ELA class. And then I'm going to reread it with her.
good.
So then this was extremely well timed for us.
Okay, super. Peter?
My name is Peter Ashi. I'm not ready. But I'll read it later.
Okay, so he talked about a couple of things that I want to pick up on, and then I'm going to ask you questions for discussion about some of those. So the one thing I want to pick up on is the Mockingbird song. Have any of you heard Mockingbirds? They sing lots of songs, not just that song.
Okay.
And they sing 3 at a time. So if you hear some song and again, and then they change, that's a Mockingbird. And if you have not seen them, they're a dark gray bird about the size of a robin or maybe a blue jay. And they have very distinguished white flashes on their wings. We used to live in the South and my husband is a bird watcher. So you have to understand, I love mockingbirds. I have seen one in release, but it's been a long time. So mockingbirds sing a lot of different songs. Another thing he talks about in there that I want to mention is stories. And just to refresh my memory, because we read in our book group, a biography of Harper Lee. I don't remember if you were there, Margaret, that time.
I was not.
Okay, well, Renee Anderson led it. Renee grew up in Alabama. And she said, Harper Lee's first name is Nell, N-E-L-L-E, which is pronounced Nail. Okay, say that with me, Nail. Okay, Nail. She gave that up when she published her book. She said that she didn't want to be called Nellie, she hated Nellie. So that was part of her story. The other part of her story is that she grew up in a small town in Alabama, and her very good friend, upon whom Dill is based. Does anyone know? Truman Capote of all people. Okay, so, and she was part of the research for In Cold Blood. Mockingbird hadn't been published yet when he called her and said, you know, I'm going to go and investigate. She did a lot of the research because think Kansas and think Truman Capote, right?
Yeah.
She could talk to people and she took copious notes. And his thanks was a little thing in the beginning of the book in the foreword. And after that, nothing. She got no credit for that whatsoever. And when her book came out and was a huge success, I mean, In Cold Blood was a huge success too, but hers came out first. And that was the end of that friendship, which is an interesting story, I think. And that's a story of brokenness too, isn't it? If you have a good friend from childhood and no. So let's talk about stories. We all have our stories. And I think one of the things he also said in there was that in this town, everybody has their assigned role. Everybody knows where they fit in that society. So if you think about your story, I want you to see if when you tell your own story or when you hear others tell their stories, how is it that stories of our own, that is not necessarily literature stories, how do they encapsulate and reflect the reality of our lives or the lives of the people that we know? I mean, think of somebody who tells good stories, and how is it that stories convey something so true about ourselves or our communities or whatever? Any thoughts on that? Give yourself a minute to think of somebody who tells good stories and see if you think of anything like that.
Well, I think everybody's always like editing their own stories based on the audience that they're telling it to. And I can say this as someone who grew up in a very rural area. There were all sorts of stories from my childhood that just don't sound the same if I tell them in Worthington as if I go back. And I bet Peter has a similar experience. He's not more so,
Yeah.
Probably even more so. That there are all sorts of stories that like I laughed about as a kid, and now I'm kind of like, that's horrifying. I mean, that was really what we did. That was really dangerous. We could have lost a hand. We could, all sorts of things that we just laughed about, and it's not really that funny now.
No. Other observations about storytelling, anyone on a screen or in the room? Yes, Peter.
A story is a culture.
Is it what?
It's a culture. The way of life.
Okay.
And as Margaret was saying, some stories that you will say it in Africa and be happy, and you cannot say it here. And there are some stories that you will be happy to say it here, but you can't say it there.
Mm.
So telling a story is very important, but sometimes you have to be very careful. Your audience,
Yeah,
the people that you are telling the story to,
yeah,
because it goes with caution.
that's a caution. Interesting observation. Anyone on there? Stories that people that you know who are storytellers? Or, yes,
Actually, I'm in the middle of writing my story. And I'm finding, well, I read a book by the man who writes the obituaries for the New York Times. It's called Yours Truly. And it's how to tell your story or how to write your own obituary. Anyway, that got me started. But what I'm finding in my writing is it's really easy to write the episodes that are funny or that I can look back on and laugh. It's very difficult to put into writing the things that reflect negatively on me or the things that were hard to get through. I don't know how that will play out as I get into my later years. I'm only up to about age 30 at this point, and I've got a long way to go. But yeah, I'm finding, the funny things or the childish or childhood episodes are just fun to write, but the tragedies are not. They're really hard to put into words.
interesting. Other observations, people you know who are good storytellers and tell stories about their lives in a way that's entertaining or captivating or. Well, my brother-in-law who just died was known for his stories and everybody said so. Everybody said so at the funeral and before and after, because he was a storyteller. And he was 88 years old when he died, so he had a lot of stories, like, you said, you get up to age 30 and you just started. And some of them were funny, a lot of them were funny. But it wasn't until much later, in fact, in February, when we were visiting them, that I found out he left home at age 15, that he had started working at age 8, and that he had scrambled his way up through New York City, being the child of immigrant parents, and clawed his way into medical school, law school, and a really successful life. But that's how he started, and he didn't tell those stories. Not to me, anyway. Heidi's my sister. So yeah, that was kind of interesting. Other observations about storytelling. Pardon me. So I can't read my notes. Okay. Here's the thing. I taught writing at Columbus State, so most of you know this. And our former pastor in Monterey was writing his memoir, and it was your thought that, I'm sorry, Joni? No, I can't read it. That made me think of this. Jay was writing his story, and he asked if I would look at it. And you're always concerned about reading somebody else's writing, especially if you like the person and you don't want to hurt their feelings. What if it's just not good? But I went ahead and read it, and I said, okay, I have 2 questions for you. One is, what's your story? Because a lot of Christian writers write the story of their conversion, but his went all the way through his life. What's your story? And the second is, who are you writing it for? And you both mentioned the audience. Is it for yourself, just to reflect on your life? Is it for your family so that your grandchildren know about you? Or do you want your church members to read it? Who do you think of as your story? Well, his title of the story was My Unlikely Path to Ministry. That was the title of his story, and that was his story. And he wrote in his foreword who he was writing it for. And I didn't have to edit it. But having that whole thing, what is the story and who you're writing it for, was apparently helpful for him. So yes, Jesus told a lot of stories. And presumably the gospel writers don't record any examples of him telling his own story. I was born in Bethlehem. I thought that was interesting.
I never saw that.
He's told a lot of stories, but none about himself. He would say, I'm the son of man. He would say who he was, but he wouldn't say, I was brought up, my father was a carpenter. He didn't say any of that. We don't know that, any of that from his own words. I think that's really interesting. One of our pastors in a much more fundamentalist church said when Jesus told a parable or something, these must have been people who knew. I'm thinking, that's the observation of someone who thinks that the Bible should be really literally true, not just a story, but a story of something that actually happened. Okay, any other observations about stories? And then we'll talk about brokenness. Okay, I didn't even remember that Jem had broken his arm. Those of you who have read the story recently, I asked, did brokenness pop out at you? And nobody said, oh yeah, that's the main. Brokenness is a theme. Do you remember English classes? Do you remember your English teacher saying, what is the theme? Right? You remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay. The theme is the main idea. But a novel, especially a novel like this, has a lot of ideas, and one of them can be brokenness, but it's not the only one. Another one surely is finding a place for yourself and finding your story within that place, marking your own identity. And from reading the obituary from the New York Times, actually, about Harper Lee, just as a reminder, because I remember, she was a tomboy, like Scout, and she didn't fit in like Scout, and she had sisters and brothers, but the friend Truman Capote, who apparently is model for her deal, apparently that is partly her story. Her father was a lawyer, so there are elements of her story in To Kill a Mockingbird, but it's not just her story. So having a role or a position to play. So I thought I would go to that. Scout struggles to find her place in Macomb. And it gives examples of some of the things that she does. Little girls wore dresses, and in her obituary, it also said that she'd be more likely to beat up on the other kids than to make friends. So let's think about our places in our lives and also in the church. And what are some of the roles that you see people playing? And can you ever have the experience of being in a role and moving to some other role that changed your life in some way? What was interesting about Harper Lee is that she grew up in this tiny Alabama town. She went to New York as a 20-year-old to become a writer, and she spent some time there. In fact, she kept an apartment in New York. She went back, but she was never part of the literary scene, and she would not talk to reporters, and the town protected her. The town didn't let journalists near her. So it's interesting how she started to change her role, and then she went back. I thought that was an interesting thing. So any thoughts about roles that we play that kind of shape who other people think we are and how those can change? And what are some things that help us to grow into different or more expanded roles? Can you talk about that a little bit, or is that too vague?
Well, I have an example. Because you were talking about roles within the church,
Right.
and it always bothered me, the Mary and Martha, like Mary listens to Jesus' feet, and that's the right thing to do, but Martha's running around trying to take care of everybody, and it's kind of like, well, somebody needs to take care, like somebody needs to bring the food out, somebody needs to make sure everybody has a drink, and it always felt to me like that was you're one or the other. And I was very much raised to be a Martha, but
Okay.
and there was always that dichotomy. And I went to a funeral recently, and I really, and it was a pretty fundamentalist church, and the guy brought up Mary and Martha, and I was like, oh, he's gonna say she was just a, and I loved it that he was like, she was both. She was the person hosting everybody, but she was also, very curious about wanting to learn more about scripture and wanting to know, like, what does this mean in the Bible? And I wanted to go up and give the preacher a hug afterward, because I'm like, thank you for not making it, you can't be both.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Yes. Other observations about this? We'll come back to a couple of things you said, but other observations about roles, either within the church or within your lives. Have you ever felt because you grew up in a rural area, have you ever felt that people assumed that you were this type of person you were because that's the type of person you were in high school? Or did you move on when you went to university and never went back? Or, I mean, have you ever felt really limited by your roles? Any observations on that?
I don't think you can never escape that, can you?
Well,
Those are the people who really knew who you were before you were influenced by a lot of other things. And I think as we grew older, we saw who we wanted to become, and we went that way without all the baggage that you carried from when you were growing up in elementary school and high school. I mean, that's something I could never really get rid of, and I enjoy coming back, but I'm also a different person than I was then.
so what was your early life that you went on and did something different? What do you like from a small town? Or, I mean,
I wasn't part of the cliques.
okay, right.
But I had a whole series of friends. I grew up right here, so I've not gone a long way in life, but my roles have changed.
And other people accept you when you changed who you are.
They're
They
different
accept-
people. A lot of them are different people. I still have a few friends that are really close friends, but the relationship I have with them is a lot different than I have with other people.
Okay, other stories, do you have stories about your roles? How about you on the screen there? Any stories about your roles?
I grew up in on a farm in South Dakota. There were 25 in my high school class. And then I left home, went to college. Each went to 3 different colleges. That's another story, but there's a progression for me that each experience was making me different.
So can you go back and still?
I go back up for the whole summer.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, it's comfortable.
That's interesting that you can be out in the world and still go back to your farming community and interesting. Because I grew up.
But it's lots of family. So to be locked into, it's just a different situation. I've lived in Columbus for 50 years. So that's, I call it a progression.
Yeah, but I grew up in North Dakota, so when I go back, I talk like them. In fact, when North Dakota State University calls me up and asks for money, I keep the student on the phone so I can listen to them talk. Wade laughs at me, but it's true, I do. Now, Renee grew up in Alabama. Renee was the one who led the discussion, for those of you who came in late, on To Kill a Mockingbird, or on the biography of Harper Lee. And she lost her Southern accent. She came from Alabama, and if you talk to her now, you wouldn't know it. But she could say nail. She could talk Alabama. Yeah, it's really interesting. Other observations about roles?
I just want to talk about work. Yes, like if you travel from Africa to maybe Europe, and then you go back, things change. The way you speak, the way you act, the way you think, everything is different. So sometimes when you get to a village, you will not even say a word, but they will know that you are not from there. Because maybe the way you dress, the way you speak, you say that, oh, this person is coming from. So it's so visible. Like when you travel, I first went to United Kingdom to stay there in London for a couple of years. So when I went back to Africa, Ghana, I have to go to my village. I decided to make sure that I would be like, my dressing and everything. So when I was in the city, I have to buy our local clothes and those things to wear, so that when you get there, you'll be able to, acclimatize yourself with them. Yeah. So those things also happen, especially when you move from the village in Africa, like to go to university or college in the city. When you go back, within some 3 months, everything has changed. Everything has changed. the way of life, the way you speak, the way you do things, totally different. Totally different. So you cannot play your role. It becomes so difficult to, play your role as you used to be.
Or even if you want to.
If yes,
And you know the title of the constable novel, You Can't Go Home Again?
It is homeschool.
Tracy piggyback on that on a more local level. So one of my good friends, Tanya, she played golf at an extremely high level. She was, LPGA and played for Duke. And her grandfather was a very well-known golfer as well. And she grew up in Naples in an affluent area, in that sort of country club style, with the expectations that you dress a certain way. Her grandfather's health declined, and he was a professor at OU. So her family moved from Naples to Athens, Ohio, which I think most, Peter, I'm not sure if you know, but it's pretty rural and not as affluent. And so she, in order to adapt to her new peer group, I think she was in high school at the time, she had two completely separate wardrobes. So she had her, this is what I wear to school wardrobe, because she could not wear what she would normally wear for golf there and be accepted and included. But then when she would go to do anything golf related, the level of expectation was that you're wearing certain types of clothing. So she had to kind of toggle in between these two worlds, and then also was a young woman playing with, men. I mean, at our law firm, she would be this young associate female, and the male partners would have her go golfing. She'd play off the men's tees and play better than they would. So she was very accustomed to silently listening to men talking, kind of forgetting that she's there. So she had a unique perspective, because she was able to kind of jump in between worlds and roles. And I mean, she's very socially, skilled, because she knows how to interact with a lot of different people. But it was the same thing where it's like, I need to play this role when I'm with this group of people, and not in a false way, but just in order to not make other people feel ill at ease. She can't wear these designer clothing around people that grew up in Athens. But the expectation is that you are expected to carry yourself a certain way with elite golfers. So it's just interesting that sometimes in terms of trying to find your place, even in the same situation, even if you're not necessarily moving, it's different groups of people, and you have to be a different person and play a different role, even when you're in the same town.
That's interesting. And it makes me think of a conference presentation. The presenter was a professor of rhetoric at Ohio State. She was giving a presentation in the 4 C's. So do I remember what they are? Composition, communication, something and something. College composition, communication. Anyway, she was African American, and she was telling the story of teaching a novel that was written and partially in dialect. And she was speaking that way as part of her presentation. And she said, people would say, oh, it's so nice to hear your voice when you're really being authentic. And I mean to tell you, that made her angry, and you can hear it in her voice. I have a number of voices, and they are all authentic. And I can remember her saying it exactly that way, because she was an academic, she knew academic language. You don't get a PhD in English for nothing. So, yeah, to be able to dress and speak and project the self that you are and not be inauthentic in different roles, that's hard. I think that's hard. I think most of us are comfortable in one or another, but to bridge the two is difficult. And I think immigrants all have that. All have that. And even those who come from immigrant families, they are reflecting both the values of their parents who come from another country and the values of their schoolmates and friends. One of our former members, and I don't know whatever happened to them, she was from Ireland and he was from Australia. And she said, her children didn't speak with an Irish accent. She says, it's because they don't listen to a word I say.
They moved away. I think they
Is
did
that-
back to
yeah.
Australia.
Did they? Okay, yeah, I can't even remember.
Their kids were about the same age as mine.
I'm sorry,
Wasn't he a professor?
he was, yeah, I
He
know.
went to Alaska.
Alaska. Oh my
That
God.
was the last I heard.
Interesting. Interesting. Anyway, I remember her saying they don't listen to a word I say. I believe it. Okay. Any other comments on roles before we move on? Have we talked about roles in the church other than what Margaret said about Mary and Martha? Are there roles in churches that kind of limit us a little bit? Because somebody said that brokenness is a theme in our church is probably pretty relevant right now. Yeah, Tracy.
I don't want to describe this as limiting, but it does seem sort of on point. So I just became a deacon, and it seems like you're always welcome to contribute in any way that you can. But it does feel like your role as deacon is compassionate service.
Right.
Okay, and you're to stick to your compassionate service. Okay, your role as elder on session is discernment. And so like you stay over here with your food train and your flower delivery and your visiting the widowed and ill, and then leave the discernment to like, so you feel, because in our last meeting, there was like something that was more of a administrative issue that came up, but it was kind of like, we need to stay over here in our box. So, and I'm not saying that, like, I'm not criticizing or anything, but it's very clear to me that like, I'm over here in this box, and this box is over here, and stay in your box. So,
Well, and I'm the deacon rep to session, and I haven't been to any session meetings lately because I'm always out of town. But yes,
Yes.
I definitely feel, for one thing, when they had closed session meetings, I wasn't invited. Because it's on a need to know basis.
and I understand the point, but it
Yeah.
does kind of, it
It is
kind
kind
of
of-
criticism.
Yeah.
It is sort of like, know your role. And like, stay in your role, which there's value to that, but it's also, it is limiting in some ways.
I think so, yeah.
It is kind of a Mary and Martha thing.
It is,
you know?
it's sort of like,
Yes.
and then, yes, or even like, I always did a lot of children's ministry, because my children are now 11 and 13, but when they were, 3 and 5, like, of course I would do the VBS, Margaret was my daughter's VBS instructor and Sunday school, and I was on the preschool advisory committee. Then it's sort of like, I have thoughts that could contribute in an adult way. But at that time, and it can change maybe over a period of time, my contribution was sort of child related, even though I might have had contributions to sort of adult ministry, but I was sort of in the land of children's ministry. Yep.
Stay in your lane.
Hmm?
Stay in your lane.
Stay in your lane.
Karen,
She's got to turn on her mic.
turn on your mic.
She's got.
I always forget. Last month, Presbyterian Women had a guest speaker, Dr. Margaret Towner, whom Tom interviewed via Zoom, and she soon after the meeting, she celebrated her 98th birthday, and she was the first female pastor ordained in the Presbyterian Church USA in the 1950s. And she was recounting her story of going as a new pastor to different churches. Often she was the associate pastor, and her first experience was that the pastor really didn't believe in having women in that role. And he said, well, you can stay here for a few years until you find a husband. And then, though she had her doctorate, she went to another church, and she was never allowed to serve communion in the church, nor was she allowed to preach sermons in the sanctuary. The only place she could serve communion was if she was visiting people who were in homes and, unable to get to church. And then sometimes she was hired as the Christian education director, and she was paid at that salary. Or she said there were other times when the only positions a female would be considered for would be in a rural church. So it was very enlightening to hear her talk about her progression as a pastor. But here is a woman who is well educated, had her doctorate, and yet there was so much prejudice over the years as to what role she was allowed to play in the church.
Thank you for mentioning that. That is really interesting and not one bit surprising, right? Not one bit surprising. So I'm re-listening to, because I can't read very well, the biography of the Elizabeth Blackwell and her sister Emily, who were the first American women physicians, or Elizabeth was the first. And her struggle is very similar. You know, women doctors were not allowed to work with anyone except women and children patients. And until there's a book called No Man's Land about the women doctors in World War I who volunteered with the Red Cross because they weren't allowed in their own country to be. Yeah, so roles can be very limiting. There's no question, roles can be limiting. And I think most of us have had that experience. I had one more question, but we need to go to church. So my other question was, Calpurnia, the African-American cook and childminder in the Finch household, takes Scout and Jim to her church. And one of the things it says in the book here, it says, I'm supposed to read it aloud or summarize it. They see a congregation that is able to worship without, quote, the usual church affects, like an organ, hymnals, or a bulletin. And I just wondered, have any of you visited a different worship community where you felt awe and wonder? Yeah, tell me.
Oh, well,
Quote.
many times, but
Yeah.
I will say, my husband and I were in South Africa and we wanted to go to church on Sunday, and we went to a Presbyterian church and we looked up there was one service that was in Afrikaans and there was one service that was in English, and the Afrikaans language is, you know, the Dutch settlers who had, you know, there's a long history with South Africa. But we went to the English language service, not, you know, we were happy to be there. We were the only white faces, and all the white people had gone to the other service.
Interesting.
And it was one of the best church services I've ever been to, right? And they were so welcoming. I mean, obviously we were very much outsiders, and we were kind of like, is it okay? Are we like upsetting you by being here? We didn't want to do that, but it was just such a wonderful, joy-filled service. And I'm sure the Afrikaans service was not like that. I mean, it might have been a fine service, but not the same thing.
Others.
Yeah, like people normally ask me, how long have you been to that church? Like, those from my
Still.
Yeah. Like, how are you able to adjust yourself to this church? People wonder, because you know the way we do our church here is different, all different. So like when you come to a community like this and you want to be part of that community, it is not easy. It is not easy at all.
Sure.
Yeah, sometimes unless you are there for some time to understand it. If not, there's no way. A lot of Black folks want to be here. I mean, they come 2 or 3 days, they will not come back again. Not that it's not good, but it's the culture.
Yeah.
It's wide different. Unless you want to learn something, but if you're able to get to know what you're doing here, then you become used to it. So those shocks will always come. Like if you come to Presbyterian Church in Ghana, the way we do our things is not like here. The way we do our Bible studies is different. Like we will not come to adult education like this. We will do it in the church. Then we divide ourselves into groups. Yes, like we come to church, we do the opening, and then we divide ourselves. This group here, then we all do the adult education.
And you'd be there for how long?
When you go to church?
Yeah.
Oh.
I'm waiting for you to say.
It's good to do.
Hours. I was gonna- Because the African American church here in this country does that too.
2 hours.
We should probably go.
Yeah.
Let's say prayer and then we'll leave, okay? Heavenly Father, we thank you for the gift of literature and for discussion. We thank you for this church and for both the brokenness of it and also our potential for healing. And we pray that you will be with the service and bless those who are reading it and be with us this coming week. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you so much. I enjoyed talking with you. I'm not going to be here next week. We will be traveling.
Virginia, I noticed that, plugins, I think I'm a bad student. Is this something that I should get in the church?
I think you can buy them in the church office, yes.
Okay,
And I don't know if they have you buy them or if you just get them.
it's a suggested donation.
Oh, it's a donation, okay. Okay.
I know, and this is what, just like a